Okay. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining tonight. Um, I'm Margaret Scott. I'm a registered professional forester for Westwind Forest Stewardship. I work at a Prairie Sound. This is kind of what I look like more in my natural habitat, out with the trees. I joined back in 2017, and have been working here since. Westwind Forest Stewardship, we hold the sustainable forest license for the French Severn Forest. So for most people, that sounds like gobbledygook. So what it means is that we do the forest management on Crown land, and the French Severn Forest refers to the area that we work in. So that roughly goes from the French River down to the Severn River from Algonquin Park over to Georgian Bay, which is quite a large area. But within that, there's quite a bit of private land, First Nations land, parks, water, all of which we don't operate or do any work on. So what we're responsible for, we don't do any harvesting ourselves, but we do oversee the planning, kind of the planning for harvest or what kind of forest management should happen, as well as overseeing any harvesting to make sure it's being done in a sustainable way. We're protecting values, that kind of thing. And then also any follow-up. So whether we're planting or naturally regenerating it, tending, site preparation, and then of course reporting on it all when it's all said and done. Some of the things that make Westwind a bit unique is that we're a not-for-profit community-based organization. So on our board, we do have industry members, but we also have community members as well as Indigenous representation. And we were also the first large public forest to be certified by the Forest Stewardship Council in Canada. That's FSC. And so you'll see the sign, like the little logo there that you've probably seen on Kleenex or paper or anything like that. And it's just a third-party certification system that says the product you're getting comes from sustainably managed forests that are measured against certain standards and audited on a regular basis to ensure that they're meeting those standards. Today, I kind of just wanted to talk about, we're going to go over quite a few pests and diseases that either have been here recently, we're currently dealing with, or maybe are on our doorstep for the future. Because we are going to go over so many, we're not going to be able to quite do a deep dive into any individual one, but hopefully I'm able to answer some questions through this presentation. And then again, at the end, if you've got further questions, I'm happy to try to answer them or at least point you in the right direction, as well as we're going to send out resources to give a bit more information on some of the things that I'm talking about today. The first pest that I wanted to talk about is spongy moth. So if you were in this region around 2021, you would have heard of gypsy moth. This is now what we're calling it as spongy moth. And it was quite a pest back in 2021. It's a non-native species and it defoliates trees. When I say defoliates trees, all I'm saying is it either kind of causes the loss of leaves or needles on trees. So that might be eating it or taking nutrients from the tree that causes it to lose its foliage. The spongy moth was first introduced to North America back in the 1860s, unfortunately through a silk industry experiment that went wrong. It is an invasive species, but it has become naturalized over time because it has been here for so long. So it actually has these kind of 7 to 10 year predictable cycles. And back in 2020, 2021, we definitely saw a big outbreak take place. So that was the year where there was those egg masses on kind of sheds and garages and trees. I mean, egg masses everywhere. There was also the caterpillars everywhere. You could actually hear the sound of their droppings, which was disgusting. But thankfully, the good news story here is that we haven't had any map defoliation in this Parry Sound district in 2022 or 2023. So the population was controlled by some of those natural predators and diseases that control the population. And thankfully, we're kind of out of that cycle now. So we can't expect in the future that we will have those back. But for right now, that outbreak is definitely over. Similarly, forest tent caterpillar is one that we tend to see in cycles. This one, a bit different, is native to North America. So it wasn't brought here, it isn't an invasive species. However, it does defoliate. It's a huge defoliator in North America. As you can see here, lots of different host trees that it'll attack. And infestations can lead to reduced growth or branch death. And even if we get Big enough infestations or multiple stresses. So if we have a drought or another pest at the same time, we can also start to see death of trees from the forest tent caterpillar. Something that I wanted to mention here is based on the name, you might expect that when you see those tents out in the forest, that's forest tent caterpillar. It's actually not. So forest tent caterpillar does not make a tent. That's eastern tent caterpillar. So that eastern tent caterpillar tends to make tents in kind of the nooks of two branches together. And it tends to have host trees like cherry and apple trees, so a little bit different, but that's where you see the tents here locally. It similarly has population cycles, so we expect to see them every 10 to 12 years, and they typically last about 3 to 6 years. We did see some back in 2019, but since then we haven't kind of seen any big outbreaks, although you will see local defoliation from a few, but the population has remained fairly low. Another pest that there's definitely a lot of interest in this area is introduced pine sawfly. It's an invasive species, and it was first found in Canada in 1931, but it's been present in this area since the early 1990s. The early larvae, so those kind of look like caterpillars, but we refer to them as larvae, are yellowish green. And then the older larvae, so the later ones, tend to have yellow and white patches on black, kind of like the photo that you see at the top there. The larvae feed on the needles of pine trees and defoliate the pine trees. And this can eventually lead to tree mortality if trees are already stressed or if we have repeated infestations. So usually if we just have one infestation and it only lasts the one season, trees can usually withstand it. But then once we have multiple stresses or multiple infestations, that's when we can start to see trees dying back. One of the reasons that there's so much interest around here is back in 2015, there was some light defoliation between French River and Point O'Barrel, and we saw it out on the islands where introduced pine sawfly was impacting some of the islands there. And then again in 2019, the Ministry of Natural Resources surveys also identified it down in Conger Township. Overall, in talking to kind of the M&R, the folks who are out there doing surveys, populations have remained relatively low, but that doesn't mean that there aren't small outbreaks or kind of isolated patches that can have quite an impact on pines. So definitely there's been reports from landowners of their trees being infected by this, but on the whole, populations have remained low in recent years. Thankfully, they do have natural predators and pathogens that are what keep that population in check. In terms of controlling it, there's a few options. If you're just dealing with one tree and it's not too high, you can kind of pick off the larvae. You can try spraying them with water to get them off. There's also insecticide options if you want to go that route, or because it's not always going to affect your tree just for a short time, you can also kind of wait and do nothing and see how the tree makes out. Onto species that are kind of more of a concern that we're dealing with right now. EAB is definitely one that's around as we speak. It's an invasive beetle which feeds on ash trees. It's native to East Asia, so it was brought here, and it was first detected in Ontario back in 2002. It is in the Parry Sound Muskoka area. It was found back in Killbear Provincial Park back in 2019. Often they get things first, unfortunately. Many things are brought with firewood. And this one has been attacking trees locally. I spoke with someone and they had to take down some trees at the Stocky Center because they had been infected with this. In terms of identification, the adults, kind of this is where the emerald ash borer name comes from, dark metallic green, about a centimeter long with flat head and black eyes. The larvae, they have multiple stages, so they can be different sizes, but they're a creamy white, and when they're fully mature, they're about 3 centimeters. But what you'll often see when you find emerald ash borer is instead of actually seeing the borer itself, you'll see the symptoms. She'll start to see crown dieback. So you'll start to see the leaves and branches start to die back at the top of the tree. You'll see bark cracks, D-shaped exit holes. So holes in the tree with one straight side and then a curved side, kind of making a capital D shape. Increased woodpecker activity, although this one you can see just if kind of a tree isn't as healthy. So that's not always an indicator that you have a EAB. And then S-shaped tunnels. So if you kind of peel the bark back, the larvae make these classic S-shaped tunnel galleries, and you'll see that shape under the bark. Unfortunately, once you start to see some of these symptoms, usually the infestation has been around for about 3 to 4 years. So it's important with this one to really keep an eye on your trees and see as this pest kind of goes through the region. In terms of treatment options, one option is an insecticide. So I actually have an ash in my backyard, and I hired someone this year to do it. So it's a triazine, it's an insecticide, and you inject it into the base of the tree underneath the bark. It has to be applied between May and August, and you need to get a professional licensed pesticide applicator to do it. It's effective up to 2 years, but sometimes in the kind of peak of infestation, they recommend every year. But that's something you just want to talk about when you have a professional out dealing with your tree. You can talk to them about kind of what they recommend going forward. Because it does cost money and obviously isn't necessarily a large scale solution, you do want to take a few things into account when deciding whether to treat your tree. So you want to make sure it's still healthy. If it's completely in decline, this isn't going to be able to save it. You probably want to make sure it's a tree that has some kind of value to you in terms of on your property or to you, and that you're not treating kind of an entire woodlot. Although if you have the money to do it, great for you. And then, of course, you want to make sure that that EAB is in the region, because there's no point treating it if we don't have emerald ash borer yet, but we do have it here. Another option, of course, is to remove trees. Unfortunately, as they get emerald ash borer, these trees do become hazard trees. And especially if they're near people or property or near recreation areas, you definitely want to be taking them down if you're not going to be treating them. If you want to get an idea of whether you should take one down or not, or how to take it down, you can consult with a forestry professional, such as an arborist. And once you've removed them, we also want to make sure that we're not spreading emerald ash borer further than it is now. So you can consult the Canadian Food Inspection Agency regulated area before moving that wood. To be totally honest, it's quite a large area, so I'd recommend in general, it's just a best practice. Don't move the wood too far. So if you're keeping it in the same area where we know there's emerald ash borer, totally fair. But if you're going 2 hours north to go camping somewhere, I would just recommend it's best practice to get local wood when you're going to be burning it somewhere else. Another pest that you may see around here is beech bark disease. Interestingly enough, this one has 2 non-native agents that cause it. So the first part of the disease is a beech scale insect. So it's this tiny, tiny insect. And it creates a vulnerability that then allows the introduction of a canker fungus to come in. This was confirmed in kind of the Baysville area back in 2010, but has since been moving around. And again, has been found around here, was found earlier in Killbear. So it's definitely one you'll see when you go out in the forest and see beech trees. Just so you know, beech trees are kind of that classic smooth gray bark. Sometimes we call it elephant bark. They're really beautiful trees, but those are what are getting this beech bark disease. In terms of identification, the mature beech scale is only about 1 millimeter long, so they're tiny, tiny. They're white little specks, and it's actually quite difficult to see them until you've got the infestation built up a bit. And then you can see multiple specks and it kind of starts to look bigger, like the picture on the left. They've got this white woolly wax covering on the body, but honestly, they're so small, they just look like white specks. And then once they've come in, create that vulnerability, we then get the red fruiting bodies of the fungus. They're particularly obvious in the fall, and this is kind of what ultimately causes that mortality to beech trees. Beech bark disease, we say, has 3 stages of spread, and it is a devastating disease, but they're very intense names. So we have the advancing front, and that's characterized by the arrival and kind of slow build of the scale insect. So you start to see some of those scale insects on the tree, and then we go into the killing front, and that's where we get rapid buildup of the scale insects. We've got a lot of the fungus infection, canker development. You start to see those red fruiting bodies on the tree, and you start to see the dieback. So you get heavy mortality once the fungus has moved in. Finally, we move on to the aftermath forest. There are lower scale populations. They've already come in. We have some residual kind of dying, declining trees left over, but most trees have already died that are beech. And then this is the stage at which we may be able to start seeing a few resistant or tolerant trees. So unfortunately with beech bark disease, one of the difficult things is that in kind of early in the disease, we'll see trees that don't have the disease yet. And it feels really exciting. And we think, oh, look, that might be a tree with resistance. But unfortunately, they kind of get the disease on different timelines. So we can't actually tell what trees are tolerant or resistant until we get to the aftermath forest once it's come all the way through. The guess is about the estimate is about 1 to 4% of beech trees are resistant or tolerant. So we're starting to get aftermath forest in kind of the southern part of our forest. So we can start to go look for whether we've got those tolerant or resistant trees left behind. One of the other concerns with beech bark disease is not only is it killing those overstory trees, so those bigger trees kind of at the top of the forest, but the main way that beech regenerates is through sprouting. So it sends shoots off the roots. And when it's stressed or when a tree dies or when you have kind of when you damage the roots in some way, it sends up new growth. And that new growth is quite prolific. And the problem is that it doesn't get the disease right away. So that new growth can be quite healthy, but also starts to shade out other species. So that could be your future forest. So when we're talking about controlling it, we do want to talk about, cutting down some of those overstory trees to make sure they don't become hazard trees. Beech bark disease has something where once it's had the disease, it has something called beech snap, where either the trunk or branches can kind of unpredictably snap off. So these trees, of course, if they're near, as I was saying before, people, property, recreation, no places where people will be, we want to make sure we're cutting them. But if you're dealing with kind of a woodlot with a ton of beech, you're also now having to consider what are you going to do with that understory, so those small trees, because you want to make sure in the future you've got a diversity of trees for your future forest. So maybe you're looking at options like cutting down some of those young beech to let other species come up as well. There's herbicide options as well, or brush saws and chainsaws is another option. The third pest that I wanted to talk about that we have in the French Severn Forest is spruce budworm. This is a pest that also defoliates, but primarily balsam fir and spruce trees. It is a native pest as well. So even though it can be quite devastating in certain areas, it's naturally occurring here. The larvae emerge in spring and feed on the trees. As you can see in that photo on the right, they have like a reddish brown body with 2 rows of white spots on the back when they're full grown, and then this black head. The adult moths are gray with brown bands on the wings. So you may have seen those. Interestingly enough, the defoliation progresses from the top of those trees downwards. So you see it right at the top of the crowns first, and then it goes down. And when stands like forest areas are quite impacted by it, they'll turn a rust color, and that's just due to the dried out needles. Trees can usually withstand 1 year of defoliation, is what we say. But then if you have multiple years of spruce budworm infestation, or if you've got other stresses, like we always say, then you can start to see that growth loss or mortality. This is just a map. It's from 2023. Often when we're dealing with mapping of forest health pests, we're a year behind because they've just done the surveys. So they're getting that mapping together, and then we'll get it in early 2025. In 2023, in the French Severn Forest, we had about 13,000 hectares of moderate to severe budworm defoliation that were mapped. And then you can also, it's a bit difficult to see, but if you can see the brown areas there, those are mortality caused by multiple years of infestations. So about just over 300 hectares of mortality was mapped there too. These are the large mapped areas. Obviously, there could be small outbreaks other places, but these were where the main impact was. Just to give you a sense of where we are in case you're looking at this map and don't have a good sense of it, that green blob on the right is Algonquin Park. And South River and kind of Sunridge are right in the middle of some of that southern red that we're looking at. So most of the defoliation that was mapped here was mapped in kind of the northeast part of our forest. So those are some of the main pests that we have currently, but I wanted to talk a bit about ones that you may have heard about that have been moving their way towards us. Hemlock woolly adelgid. It's a tiny, like 2-3 millimeter aphid-like insects, and it attacks and kills hemlock trees. So it actually attaches to the base of the needles, just along those twigs, as you can see there, and it feeds, extracting nutrients and sap. It forms these white woolly masses, thus its name. And if you flip over a hemlock branch, you can actually see it on the base there. If you start to get large numbers, it can defoliate, deplete, and eventually kill the hemlock tree. And the eastern hemlock, which is the hemlock that you would see around here, is the only native host in our area. So this map really shows us kind of how it's progressed and where it's been in recent years. Hemlock woolly adelgid originates from southern Japan, but came to the US in the 1950s. We initially had some populations in Ontario that were identified but eradicated back in 2014. But then in 2019 to 2022, it was found in a few areas of the Niagara region. So on the map here, you can see that the kind of reddy brown is hemlock woolly adelgid detections before 2022. And there's very, very few. There's just a few down in the southern part of Ontario, right by the border there. But most is still in the United States. And then you can see after 2022, there's one small yellow area down in the Niagara region. But more surprisingly, if you look at the north shore of Lake Ontario, you'll see the area that in 2022 was confirmed near Grafton in Northumberland County. That one was a bit more of a concern because in Niagara, the hemlock forest tends to be a bit more individual and not as connected, whereas there are some adjacent hemlock forests next to the detection that we found back in 2022. So that's definitely something that we'll be watching and seeing how it progresses. It's kind of more expected down in Niagara, where we had it just on the other side of the border, and have seen it kind of in the past. Like I said, so this is actually me. I went down to New York State a number of years ago, and I was in a hemlock area that had hemlock woolly adelgid. And it was a windy day, and you actually, when the wind blew, some of the ova sacs, like these white little woolly masses, would come off the trees and almost look like snow. It was neat, but also really concerning. And when we left, we had to use lint rollers and all sorts of things to make sure we weren't bringing anything back to Canada. These ova sacs are visible from November to May, mostly prominent later in March to May. You might also notice other symptoms. So that dieback or needle loss, some thinner grayish green crown, discoloration of the foliage, and then eventually death of trees. This one is fairly devastating to hemlock, and they're trying different things to kind of deal with it. They're releasing parasitoid wasps to control it. There's also different spraying options that they're using, but obviously a concern as it moves, and we'll keep an eye on it as it goes forward. The last pest I wanted to talk about is oak wilt disease. So this is a vascular disease that affects oak trees. It actually affects red oak trees more than white oak trees and usually leads to death sooner. It's caused by a fungus and it restricts flow of water and nutrients through the trees. It already occurs in 24 states in the United States, including Michigan. And then in 2016, it was confirmed just over 500 meters from Windsor, Ontario. So they have been watching it for a number of years and expecting it to come to Ontario. And back in 2023, it was found in the Niagara region, but also in Springwater Township, just south of Barrie. Thankfully, all the potentially infected trees in both areas were removed, and there was no new detections in 2024. They did lab analysis of the trees to ensure that anything that was possibly infected was removed. But definitely a concern that we found it all the way up in Springwater Township, and that's another one that we're going to be watching going forward. In terms of identification, this one's a bit interesting in that the discoloration of the leaves progresses from the outside to the middle. So it's from the edge to kind of the center, and you can see it in the photo there that you get kind of that bronzing of the leaves, and you still have kind of that natural green or red color in the center. It also, the impacts start at the top of the crown and progress downwards, and you'll see premature leaf fall, as well as these fungal mats just under the bark, so on the right photo there, and they emit a fruity smell. I obviously haven't smelt it, but people talk about it almost being like juicy fruit or something. Anyways, and over top of these pressure mats, you will see vertical bark cracks in the trunk and in large branches as well. So you might see those cracks and then be able to kind of take a piece of bark out and then see those mats that are underneath. Unfortunately, there's no cure for oat wilt, but there are some things we can do to kind of help control it. So like I said, with all of these, a major way that pests and diseases are spread are firewood. So I just always recommend not moving firewood very far, using local firewood as much as possible. With this one, because one of the ways it's spread is by oak bark and sap beetles, you don't want to prune or damage the oak trees between April to July, as this is the most vulnerable time for the spore spread. So when those insects can spread the spores. Also, like everything else, we want to identify and remove the diseased trees so that they can't continue to spread the disease. But interestingly enough, this can also be spread to adjacent trees, and it's quite a common route of spread by root grafting. So that's when the roots are touching each other and connected and can spread the disease to the roots. So actually, if you're in a stand and you have a healthy and a diseased tree beside each other, you have to disrupt the root connection. So there's machines or different ways to do that, but obviously a lot more difficult than just kind of cutting down the tree at the stump. Hemlock woolly adelgid and oat wilt are both pests that the Canadian Food Inspection Agency regulates. So if you do think you see a sighting, or if you have it on your property, these are ones that you want to be reporting to the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. So when I send out resources after this, I'll make sure that I have a link to the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, there we go, so that you know kind of those resources and can reach out to them if you do see it moving up, because one of the oak wilt sightings was actually made by an arborist. It wasn't made by kind of someone out there surveying and looking for it.